All right, should be recording now. So today we have Ben Watkins of Real Atheology joining us. So why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, so my name's Ben Watkins, and I'm the host of Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast. And so what we do with this podcast project is we explore questions in the philosophy of religion from non-theist perspectives. But we do it in a way that is robustly, philosophically, and scientifically informed. And so, really trying to find the best of the best when it comes to answering questions in the philosophy of religion from non theist perspectives. So, it's going to try to dive in much deeper than kind of the superficial pop culture way of theists and atheists interacting that you often see online and sometimes in popular literature, like in the new atheist movement. We like to demarcate ourselves from that movement and put ourselves firmly in an analytical philosophy tradition that emphasizes the clarity of concept, the rigor of argument, an emphasis on the natural sciences and what can be known from experience. So yeah, that's our project. Check us out. We're on Twitter, Facebook. We have a YouTube channel. We have our podcast. So wherever your favorite podcast outlet is, whether it be Apple or Podbean or Spotify, we're on it. So check us out.
Yeah, I'll definitely post links in the description, to your content so people can check it out. So one of the things I wanted to do before, basically the theme of this was I wanted to talk about why you're an atheist or what led you to become an atheist, just in general. But before we even get to that, what was your religious background and upbringing like?
Right. So I grew up in the rural south of South Carolina. And so I grew up in a Quaker-like tradition. And so what I mean by a Quaker-like tradition is that it was a society of friends that met at people's houses instead of a establishment of worship like a church.
Mm-hmm.
So we would have things like Bible studies in people's homes, and people would give, testimony, and if they felt moved by the Spirit, they would speak. And it was just a kind of quaint, humble service on Sundays and Wednesdays. And so I grew up in that faith my entire life. And about 18 or 19 years old, I started to kind of take it more seriously in the sense of, I'm an adult now. And so this theological tradition is supposed to play a very important part in my life. But, up until that point in my life, it was just something I did with the family.
Right.
And it just, it was just something I came along for. Well, once I was 18 or 19 and I was off to college, I was on my own. And so it was my choice at that point, whether to continue in that tradition or to find some other tradition. And so I just kind of started exploring, and that exploration lasted well into my mid-20s when I finally kind of, I think, settled down in my philosophical ways. My journeys kind of took me all over the place, and then I kind of just settled in the metaphysical naturalist camp in an analytic tradition of philosophy. And so I've just kind of my project is just kind of snowballed from there, because one of the great things about the philosophy of religion is that it touches on so many other areas. So not only do you have the natural sciences that can be relevant to it, but you can have other philosophical areas like the philosophy of mind and moral philosophy. And even right now, one of the things that I'm working on is the philosophy of probability. So probability theory and how that relates to our concepts of evidence. And so I think that's just really neat how I can get all these exposure to all these different domains of inquiry. And I can draw from so many different tools to try to answer really, really big, interesting questions that really you don't find questions like you find in the philosophy of religion elsewhere. They're kind of a unique set of questions on their own, and they're really fun.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've definitely noticed about like kind of wading into the waters of philosophy or religion is there's just so many things. Even if you want to be conversant to some degree, you have to learn a lot. So like, for example,
yeah.
I would say probability, like the more advanced probability stuff is my biggest weakness right now. I'm still kind of newbie compared to some of the people that I interact with on some issues, but yeah, definitely like probability and like all this other stuff. So it's definitely interesting to kind of wade into that stuff for someone that's interesting into these topics. So.
Oh yeah, and it's endless. You could spend your whole life just constantly digging deeper and deeper and deeper and finding more and more rich ways of thinking about. I want to say the same thing, but it's not really the same thing. But a family of questions. That's just it's really neat, and a lot of people. It's got kind of a taboo. Like you're not supposed to talk about politics and religion, and one of the things I'd like to think I'm doing with my project is to kind of push back on that taboo and say, no, religious and political questions are really interesting, and what we need to do is learn, ways to constructively dialogue about these kinds of things. So that's another way in which my project distinguishes itself from like a new atheist project that is kind of harsh in their criticisms. They're very sharp and they're rhetorically flourishing, and there's a lot of quips that make for great sound bites. But that's just not really our project,
Right.
The rhetoric is for us is kind of the icing on the cake sort of thing. We're more interested in the substance, the underlying arguments, taking those seriously and dialoguing in respectful and constructive ways with theists.
Yeah.
And while trying to resolve as many disagreements as we can, in hopes of potentially recruiting people into our camp.
to the dark side.
To the dark side, exactly. Out of the dark side, but we have cookies,
right?
Sort
Yes.
of thing.
I was gonna say, yeah, politics and religion are the most fun things to talk about. I don't know why people don't want to talk about them.
Yeah,
I
agree with you.
It might be that, probably just because like to the average person, those are the most kind of tribal things that they kind of have their positions, and some people don't think about it. Not everyone, but like that might be kind of hits a nerve for some people if you kind of bring up stuff like that. But I'm glad you said. I was gonna push back a little bit. I'm glad you said it's that the flourish is like the icing on the cake, because you're a little spicy on Twitter, like I was talking about, earlier before we even started recording this, which I like a little bit. I feel like people. I'm sorry, I'm not going to try to interrupt you too much, but I feel like one of the things, it's like the new atheists, or whatever you want to understand that as. It seems like they were good with the rhetoric, but there's no substance. So if you can kind of sort of combine the two to where you got not over the top, spiciness, but if you can have the substance and just sprinkle a little spiciness on the top of it, I feel like that's good.
So I totally agree with you. So like, I don't think that rhetoric is, it's not something that I completely ignore. I think that
Right.
there's a healthy balance of substance and rhetoric, because at the end of the day, we are dialoguing.
Right.
And when we're on Twitter, it's a public dialogue. So it's a dialogue that people are going to be able to see from the outside. And so I will certainly concede right from the beginning that the past 4 years have kind of jaded me as far as my tolerance level goes for things that are just kind of obviously BS, or
Right.
just, like, okay, you're not coming to this in a good faith. Like, that's fine if you're not going to come into it in a good faith. Just go, like, we're just not going to engage. And
Right.
let's, and so I just don't have a lot of tolerance for a lot of nonsense in my own camp.
Right.
I'm sure you've seen, I'm quite notorious for my resistance to this lack of belief definition of atheism that seems so prevalent in our circles, because I think that it's fundamentally coming from a dishonest place. It's coming from a place of bad faith when interacting with theists, and that there is a very simple, straightforward language game that we can adopt that doesn't introduce any sort of confusion. Everyone understands it. It's clear, and we can have a productive dialogue. And so when people want to deviate from that model, I'm just like, okay, we're just going to have a different conversation. And
Yeah.
so sometimes you have to be pretty spicy with those kinds of people, where you're just like, like if you're not even willing to concede this point, like if you're not even willing to concede this, pretty superficial point, Like, what's the point in even having a dialogue? Because it doesn't seem like that person is going to make any sort of concessions or moves that are constructive. They're wherever they are, they're gonna plant their flag on that hill, and they're just gonna die on it.
Yeah.
And so I just don't find those interesting or worthwhile, other than to just have fun with rhetoric and to just be sharp and to just, make people realize, like, hey, what you're doing is super objectionable, and it's kind of beneath someone who's taking this seriously.
Yeah.
And there's really no nice way of saying, like, you're kind of being an ass. And there's, there's no one nice way to say it, but some, people do behave that way,
Yeah.
especially on Twitter.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I feel like I've learned who to mute like quicker, like I don't usually block for myself, but I've had enough experience on Twitter that basically I can tell within the first couple interactions, like this is a temporary mute. This is a permanent mute. Like I have like a filter in my brain.
I struggle with that. That's definitely my weakness. Cause like I like naturally, like I get along with people very well. Like I'm a kind of an easygoing guy, and I like to have conversation. And so like, I feel like it takes a lot to rub me the wrong way, but over the past 4 years, I've definitely noticed that I am getting more and more intolerant of kind of just the nonsense that just kind of exists in the world. There's just kind of people that just, they go about their everyday lives just with these uncritically held assumptions about how the world works that affect other people.
Right.
And once you've reflected on it yourself and you've seen how serious and important these issues are, when you see other people having nonchalant and trivial attitudes towards you, it rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah. I would say I would be careful a little bit, because I don't think every person that does the lack thing is like has bad motives. I don't think you're actually trying to say that, but I think generally speaking, I would agree that in my experience, a lot of times is used to, kind of push away the burden of proof.
It's a way to play hide the ball with a burden of justification. That's what I'm getting at. So the people who engage in that game of hide the ball with a burden of justification, that's totally coming from a bad faith place.
Right.
Not everyone who uses the lack theist definition of atheism is doing that.
Right. Yeah.
Certainly concede that, because that's just obviously empirically the case. And it's also its own language game. I get that this lack of belief conception of atheism came about in an age of internet discourse. And so this is how people use language. And so it's a legitimate language game. It communicates meaning. People understand what people mean by it. And so I'm not challenging it on any grounds like that. I'm just saying there are different language games, and some are better and worse. Just like there's rules of grammar, and some rules of grammar are better than other rules of grammar. And we can have debates about it, whether or not we should use an Oxford comma or not use an Oxford comma. There's no truth in the world about how you should, whether you should or should not use an Oxford comma. But there are arguments. There are arguments that could sway you from one side or another. There are reasons to think that not all language games are created equally. And so when you find one that benefits both parties to a discussion in nearly every way, and is just simple, and is also the historical and the ordinary language game of how these terms are used, it's just kind of a no-brainer. It's just one of those things that you just go, okay, we're going to accept this and just move on. And it's not going to be an issue. And so when it does become an issue, that gets on my nerves.
No, I get it. My approach, I think, is I totally agree. Like I spoke when I interviewed Graham Oppie, I asked him about, some similar stuff, like the definition of atheism. And he was basically like, he agrees with your definition. And he was basically like, though, in some of these contexts, I don't really care. And I don't want to say that, I wouldn't take it that far, but I would just say when I talk to people, normally I kind of wait and see whether the lack stuff is motivated by an avoidance of the burden of proof before I'm like, because sometimes I feel like it can kind of get in the way of a discussion, not always, by quibbling, but I don't know. I'm not sure if that's just a difference in approach, but this actually plays well into, I was going to ask later what, obviously if the main point of this is why you're an atheist, the definition of atheism is important. And so basically it sounds like you're saying your understanding when you say I'm an atheist is I don't believe that there's a God.
Correct.
Or
Yeah. So like I make claims.
Right.
And I make claims that imply, like, from a certain conception of atheism, that just
Mhm.
imply that I'm an atheist.
Right.
And that's just an implication of beliefs that I hold. And so, and I'm constant, what I do in philosophy of religion is challenge those beliefs, try to justify those beliefs or reasons to change those beliefs. That's, kind of just what it is. There's
Right.
considerations that will move me to change my mind potentially. I feel like I've followed this path now, and I've followed the evidence, and I've come to my conclusions in the sense that they're my beliefs, but they're beliefs about propositions that can be true or false. There's an
Right.
objective fact of the matter of whether I'm making some mistake, or if someone who disagrees with me, perhaps they're a theist, are they closer to the truth in some way? And if they are, how can I discover that? I'm not going to be able to do that unless I try to resolve my disagreements with this theist. Now, we might have very, very deep, irresolvable disagreements, but that doesn't mean that I can't learn something else
Right.
from a theist. And so, but all of this requires the language game that I was just arguing for, because you want to approach these questions initially with an open mind and to be a quote unquote free thinker. At the end of the day, if we're talking about an identity, like a label that we were to, give ourselves, one I give myself as a progressive humanist because I think it just describes me. But at the end of the day, I'm a free thinker. Like when I approach problems, I want to follow the arguments wherever they lead. I want to let evidential chips fall where they may, and then proportion my belief to the evidence. That's just my approach. In anything and everything that I question. And so when I started my journey into philosophy, there were certain things that, I obviously started as a theist,
Mhm.
but as I started to pull the thread on different beliefs that I had, I started to have that free thinking attitude and saying, hey, things are not really adding up. There are a lot of tensions here that I didn't really notice before, didn't really care to reflect on enough. And the more and more of those tensions I started to unwind, that's what changed my mind over time. There was no real moment of like, okay, I can clearly demarcate, this is when I was a theist and this is when I was an atheist. It was a matter of pulling at the thread. And over
Mhm.
time, there were several moments during that journey that I remember, that were very big for me, that, were very big paradigm shifts for me. And then as those paradigm shifts added up, it finally came to the point where I had to admit to myself that, I'm not a theist anymore.
Right.
Didn't know what I was. And then I became a metaphysical naturalist as I studied the evidence more and more. I was initially a moral skeptic. I didn't think that there were things like moral truths. And the more I went in, I investigated that question, I've changed my mind. I am now a robust moral realist. I went from one end of the error theorist nihilist
Mhm.
to the other end of robust objective realist. So I mean, my beliefs have changed wildly over the past decade, but over time by pulling on threads. There was no decisive argument. There was no eureka moment where I just figured out, hey, this is the thing. The idea of like two people debating and like one person just having this moment and going,
Mhm.
oh yes, I'm going to
Right.
change my mind and come into your camp and we're going to shake hands, and that's just not how
Yeah.
psychology works.
Right. But don't you can't have morality without God, Ben. You can't,
Yeah,
morality
yeah.
depends on God, and you just, and when you say you started pulling on the threads, it just means you exchange the right presuppositions for the wrong ones. You just got the wrong presuppositions now.
Yeah,
No,
exactly. In
just
very
I'm fun.
many ways, like I know that's kind of a tongue-in-cheek comment,
Right.
but like in a very real sense, it is true. It was a matter of swapping out presuppositions to resolve tensions.
Mhm.
Like I found tensions in beliefs, and I was like, well, how do I resolve these tensions? Well, I could just change these presuppositions,
Right.
and things started making more sense. And that was kind of the process of reflective equilibrium that took place over time and changed my mind.
So you basically laid out what were the specific things that, like the threads you're saying you unraveled? What were, I mean, later I was going to kind of go through that piece you wrote on Capturing Christianity's website about why you're an atheist. We can go through that later, but just in general, kind of an airplane view of some of the things that kind of made you start to question, even if it didn't change your mind right away.
Yeah. So always from the beginning, even as a kid, the problem of religious disagreement was just in the back of my mind. That one just kind of always stuck, if there is this God, well, then why do all these people disagree about what God's saying? That was just kind of a standing question in my mind. But then when I started to take my faith more seriously, I was eventually introduced to apologetics.
Right.
And of course, within apologetics literature, you can have all the arguments for God that you want, but everyone has to say something about the problem of evil.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's when I really kind of had to face the problem of evil. And that one was really kind of the big, when I really started to pull on the string, I just didn't really know how deep that rabbit hole went.
Right.
But going down that rabbit hole and finding variations of the problem of evil in something like the problem of hiddenness, and how, the problem of evil is basically a problem of bad stuff. Well, one of those bad things is that, God seems hidden. God seems hidden, and that's one of the causes of religious disagreement. And so all these threads started kind of coming to get, once you start pulling on all the, this was probably 6 months, a year and a half of kind of going, pulling on these threads, and then kind of realizing, oh, there's this other view, there's this other model. And then another thing that got me was just on the science. So growing up, one of the controversies of my youth was creationism versus evolution. And so the more that I explored the concept of evolution, there was a time when I would have said, well, evolution is just a theory. And
Mm-hmm.
that, there's this other view, this creation view that's just more probable. How could you have all these things like beauty and design? The intuitive design argument was very appealing to me at one point in my life. And so as I began to study the biological evolution, from high school biology through college, reading different things about biology, I started to realize just how powerful this theory was, and that this was a huge blow to this idea of special creation. And so that was a thread. But then there were other less rational threads that got pulled on. So I'm married and I have a kid now, but when I first started dating, who's now my wife, we had talks about things like religion. So she was raised in a Catholic home, and I was not raised in a Catholic home. I was raised in a Protestant tradition. And so if we're going to get married and have kids, how are we going to, what sort of faith are we going to have to raise our children? Because my parent, my mother was raised in this faith Quaker-like faith that I was, but my dad was raised Episcopalian. And so my dad eventually converted to this other faith. And so one faith subsumed the other in the relationship. So what would we teach our kids? And so like my wife was very adamant that she wasn't going to give a religious instruction to our kid, that she wanted to let that kid decide for themselves answers to those big religious questions, just like I was doing at that time. I was having this approach of, I'm trying to figure all out what I'm believing. And she's like, I want to let her do that. I don't want you to raise her in a tradition. And so pulling on that thread, a more secular way of thinking about things like ethical problems and scientific questions really shifted me from that theistic camp into a non-theistic camp, into a naturalist camp, into a humanist camp. Those are just the inevitable results of me taking these questions in what I thought to be the most serious ways that I could.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say, I mean, my own experience was more, I moved from Christianity to agnosticism for a while, sort of as a placeholder, as I was kind of digging in. I didn't actually become sort of an atheist until I'd read like Craig and, some more denser apologetic stuff when I was a Christian. But when I started really kind of going into philosophy of religion, that's when I sort of started tipping to the atheism side. And I think I've heard it compared to like the duck rabbit picture. So like theism, and I think, I forget the philosopher's name, where basically he said he could look at it from either way, but then started
Ludwig Wittgenstein.
Well, so
duck rabbit.
Okay, yeah. So there's multiple people. I don't know if that's the one I'm thinking of, but anyway, so looking at the world through a theistic picture seemed to make sense. But the more I kind of read in philosophy of religion, I could kind of see, if you look at it a different way, it kind of seems like that is easier for me to look at it that way once I start actually thinking about this a little bit more. So I guess that's kind of an image of what happened to me with atheism. It just seemed to, and that's not like an argument or anything, but it just, as I was thinking about the arguments and kind of looking at the world, it just seemed more and more that, if you look at it as a duck, it started to look like a rabbit way more. Like the more I'm reading and more I'm kind of like conceptualizing all this stuff. So,
yeah.
So go ahead. Yeah, I think you're about to say something.
So it's one of those things that you can look at it from multiple perspectives yourself without ever accepting any of them. That's one of the beauties of philosophy, is philosophy helps you see those different ways of looking at things, even if you're a pure skeptic or solipsist in it,
right.
Even if you have just the craziest of beliefs, what's really important is how you're thinking in these ways, because they're allowing you to see more than what we often just take for granted. Like a lot of times we just make assumptions without reflecting about them. It's just human nature. We can't think about everything all the time. So we have to make assumptions, and some assumptions are just never get critically examined. But this process, it's one of the things I like about the philosophy of religion. It's why I keep coming back to this project and have this podcast, because I feel like there's just always something to look at in a different way, to use a different philosophical tool, to examine something in a new light, and to see how that roughs over spotty patches and how you might have been thinking about something else because you figured something else out, and that helps you understand what you couldn't understand before. And that's, to me, just a thrilling experience when it happens.
So let's now, and you've already touched on it a little bit, but a little of this, but the article that you wrote, the first section had to do with religious skepticism. So, and actually you mentioned too, and like you said, you distinguished your project from the New Atheists, but it sounded like, at least initially, some of the New Atheist stuff kind of made you at least question. So how does that relate to like religious skepticism and all that stuff? Yeah.
So for sure that the New Atheists, kind of the New Atheists, there was low hanging fruit.
Right.
There's if you go and look in the geological literature, you're not going to find Noah's flood. Well, that can be a huge shock to a lot of Christians. It was certainly a shock to me when I initially started questioning these things. And so the idea behind religious skepticism is that we take a neutral response to claims of religious nature, so that we know from religious experience that religions disagree, and that conflict is bred from these disagreements, and that there's reasons to be skeptical of these sorts of religious claims. And so that we look for justifications for whatever the religious claim might be, but also for constructing alternatives to them, to say that, no, this is mistaken, this is the right view, and this is why the view is mistaken. This is how we know that this view is mistaken and this view is right. I think that process is really the driving theme for religious skepticism. Now, I think there's an extreme of this. And so I think New Atheists can take this, and often do take this, to extremes, and that they just apply skepticism wantonly and irresponsibly, and in ways that often leave you kind of wondering, okay, well, one of my favorite examples is that a lot of people will die on the hill. There's no evidence for theism. Well, in one sense, that's just not true, because we can conceive of, there could be attic, noises in my attic, and that hypothesis is more probable if that there's gremlins in my attic than if not. Well, we all know none of us takes the hypothesis that there's gremlins seriously. But if we conceive of evidence probabilistically, we can truly say that that observation is more probable given the gremlin hypothesis than the not gremlin hypothesis. That can just be a true statement. It's not a very good argument, but it is a very trivial sense in which we can say some observation is evidence. And the same goes for theism. We can just say that there are things that are, things like religious experience. The fact that there are religious experiences is just more probable given theism than not theism. That's just a true claim of probability. And if we understand evidence probabilistically, then it's trivially true that there is some evidence for theism. Now, you might not think that that evidence is sufficient for belief, or that there are other pieces of evidence that outweigh that. That might be how one evidential chip falls, but there are many other evidential chips that fall in the other camp. And so when you see someone in a kind of new atheist situation where they just won't concede anything to the theist, they just will say there is no evidence. No, and then they'll just say, well, that's not evidence. Well, that's not evidence. And then that will devolve into these claims like, well, arguments aren't evidence. Well, claims of evidence are themselves arguments. Like, you start to see the nuclear effect of the skepticism gone awry. And so I think religious skepticism, or responsible religious skepticism, distinguishes itself from the new atheist rhetoric that just kind of bats at the low-hanging fruit, has very, very many good points, good substantive points. Someone like Sam Harris or Christopher Hitchens can characterize the problem of evil in very, very sharp terms that are very clear and very cogent and very rhetorically strong. But it can, get pretty sloppy in other areas. And so I think religious skepticism, properly understood, tightens that up, does away with those less valid ways of thinking.
Right. I think it's interesting too. I mean, again, in my own experience, it wasn't really, I actually read The New Atheists. It had nothing to do with my deconversion of Christianity, like at all. Like it wasn't because I read Dawkins or read Sam Harris. Actually, because I read the Bible like once a year since I was 19. And so the more and that really helped my faith at first. But then the more year after year, the more I did it, it's kind of slowly chipped away. So it was more I remember vividly, I was in my car before work, reading the Bible. I would sometimes use that time, and I was in Genesis, and I was just thinking, I don't know, some story hit me a certain way where I was just maybe this is just a story. You know what I mean? Not everything is a myth in the Bible. That's not what I'm saying. But just for some reason, there's just this moment that I remember that this kind of, what if you're putting too much stock in a supernatural explanation for these texts? What if you can explain all of this by just appealing to human beings, and you don't need this additional hypothesis to explain what we're seeing here?
I feel like you're forced to do that with something like the flood story. So you're just, I very vividly remember, going and looking in, geology stuff on the internet, trying to find, there's nothing about Noah's flood in it. And so you just have to say, okay, well, what if what explains that is this is just a story. This is a story that now it might have some other function. It might, in some other way be theologically relevant. It's just not a historical account of what happened.
Yeah, it was a local flood. It was just a local flood,
Yeah, or something. Yeah, well, and those are the ways that you try to when you try to square it, and you kind of go, this doesn't really square. And young Earth creationism, I will be honest with you, did erode for a while. Like I remember seeing Kent Hovind, like when I first started, like, you know, going on YouTube in like 2008, 2009-ish time frame, you know, and seeing Kent Hovind like do, and you know, there's not enough dust on the moon, and I was like, what in the world is this guy like? This guy's not, you know, 'cause it was one of those things like when you watch wrestling as a kid,
Right.
and like you don't know if it's real or if it's fake, but you're pretty sure it's fake. But like everyone's playing, like everyone's in on it, and so everyone's playing with you, acting like it's real. And so that's kind of how I felt with this. I was like, this can't be serious. This isn't like this is an act. Like, and I couldn't make heads or that definitely eroded because I remember being like, I don't know what I believe, but I don't believe that.
Right. Yeah. See, you just got raised with the wrong version of Christianity, and now you're an atheist. That's what,
Yeah,
I like to put my hat on and just assume, you know, there's certain Christians out there that may watch this, and there's going to be psychoanalyzing in your heads, like, oh, he was a young Earth creationist, and you know all this stuff, and that's why he's an atheist. He wasn't given the right version of Christianity. He'd still be a theist today.
Well, it probably didn't help that I went to school for engineering, and like, so I'm a nuclear engineer, and so like things like radioactive decay. So like when I would hear things like, you know, that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, and that things were just created the way that they were looked like, you know, and I was like, but no, wait, like we know the half-life of uranium is like billions of years old. Like we know that, and we know that stars are like, you know, billions of light years away. Like trying to make that argument to me after I had already been to school to learn the science that was exactly contrary to what they were saying did not help their case at all.
Right.
I had too deep of an understanding for me to have been duped by something like that.
Right. So this actually
that's not to say I couldn't have been duped. At one point in my life, I believed the moon landing was fake. That was before I went to engineering school. Thankfully, you know, I was very, very young, and I was very naive. But I've certainly fallen into the traps of just, you know, what was I thinking? How could I have possibly believed something so ridiculous?
Yeah. This actually ties well into the next section of your not paper, your blog, not blog, I don't know, whatever, your piece.
Yeah.
So science and the supernatural, and this ties into miracles too, which is another thing I think we agree a lot on. So how did kind of your scientific background start to erode just in general skepticism, and also when you apply that kind of thinking towards miracle claims? I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit about that and how that kind of, you know, made you more skeptical.
Oh yeah, for sure. So I always knew that there was this supernatural element to Christianity. There was a very important event, this resurrection that Jesus, and that this was a theologically significant event. This was meant to communicate a message to us.
Mm-hmm.
And so that really felt in tension with this other idea that I had of this idea of science, this idea of going and empirically investigating the world and having experiments and things like repeatability, things like observations, ways of making predictions or retrodictions, ways of falsifying certain claims while confirming others. That model just didn't fit into this idea of a supernatural event that happened only with a few select people, and that process has been passed down through traditions of oral traditions, forms of life, religious texts, and that's how the divine was communicating its will with us. That now, obviously, I couldn't have articulated these thoughts like I just did back then, but that's really kind of the tension that I think I felt between miracle claims, because I was just like, how can we be sure that these miracle, because obviously, again, this is where disagreement comes in. There's these other competing religions that have their own miracle claims, and we're just like, well, those just miracles didn't happen. Those people are just saying that because that's just, they have the wrong tradition, they're mistaken, those things didn't happen. And I'm like, Yeah, but they're saying the very same thing about our miracles. Wouldn't it be great if there was an experiment that settled this disagreement, and we could all say that there's this third person set of facts that will just settle the matter, like you get with something in science, but science just wasn't applicable to that.
Right.
And so, and the more science I studied, the more it seemed like there was a paradigm shift in the Enlightenment, and that paradigm shift becomes pretty apparent with the secular success of the natural sciences. So the more we remove assumptions about God's intentions, about what a God would want the world to be like, the more our scientific methods progress. The more progress. And so the famous example is Laplace is showing his model of the solar system to Napoleon, and Napoleon says, I've read the works of Newton. He included God in his, what role have you left for the divine in your model? And Laplace famously quips back, I have no need for that assumption. And so I think what he's getting at is that there was just this paradigm shift, that it's just you no longer needed the theistic assumption in the natural sciences. We can make sense of the natural world without these theistic assumptions. This eventually culminates with Nietzsche saying God is dead. Look, we've cast him out. We're setting out on an open sea of our own knowledge, and we've killed God in this process of an enlightenment. And so the success of the natural sciences really solidified how I think about miracles, in the sense that the laws of nature that are discovered through our methods of science are some of the best evidences of testimony that we have. Right. For something, so that's something that a miracle claim has to overcome.
Right.
But a miracle event is also very, very rare. If it wasn't a rare event, if miracles just happened they wouldn't be able to communicate a message. It's by the fact that they're very, very rare that's how they communicate this religiously significant message. So they're rare. We have a lot of evidence against them, and they conflict. Our experience tells us that miracle, like evidence of testimony of a religious nature, is really terrible. As Homo sapiens, we have propensities towards the marvelous that make us make claims that are just sound incredible, but almost certainly did not happen. And so that's how I think about miracles to this day, in that there's just these three features of the question of miracles. They're very, very rare. Evidence of testimony in their favor is really, really bad, and the evidence against them is really, really strong. And so I think those three beliefs just make it the case that we shouldn't believe miracle claims. Like, we should be our religious skepticism, if we take these assumptions and accept them, our religious skepticism is going to say we should be skeptical of these religious claims. We do not have sufficient evidence to believe these, and if we were to have sufficient evidence to believe them, it would look it would look much more like a controlled science experiment than it would something like a survey of historical documents.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I was going to say that's what it seems like the debate about how you approach miracle claims is way more foundational than so people try to argue about the resurrection. But the foundation of that, is how do you approach miracle claims first? And then we can consider what are the evidence. I'm not saying that, some people accuse him of making a circular argument, like miracles are impossible. That's obviously not what he meant. That's not what I don't think what we're saying. It's just that what I would take, and I think you would take, a proper approach to miracles should be foundational. And then we consider okay, what is the actual evidence that you're giving me here? And yeah, that's one of the things is, even when I was a Christian, I would say I had a Humean bent, without even realizing. So the things that I had pillars sort of holding up my faith, and the belief that some of this prophecy in the Old Testament predicted Jesus, just things like that. And once inerrancy, just different things and once those threads, again, as you'd said, were pulled, and all I had left was just the Gospels and Paul's conversion experience, I was Like, I don't think so. Because in the back of my mind, I had this kind of Humean skepticism towards miracle claims already. And so some of these other pillars were what were kind of holding up my resurrection belief, that were kind of like a coherent whole. And so once you remove them, and I have my general skepticism towards miracle claims intact still, and all you have is basically the Gospels and Paul, like, I don't know about that. So, I mean, it's just
I know I totally relate to that. I kind of think of, visualize beliefs as kind of like a spider web. And so like you pull enough anchors of the web will fall. And when you build up your own beliefs, you've got to connect a lot of different anchors to different places before you can really get in and fill in all the details. And so yeah, I totally get that whole experience of having this kind of this skepticism in the background, but it's a skepticism that theoretically you can overcome if you have the pillars of these other things. Yeah, skepticism would win the day if we didn't have these other pillars, or if these other evidential chips hadn't fallen like I think they've fallen. But then once you realize those evidential chips didn't fall that way, or that those pillars are made of sand, then you kind of fall into that kind of skepticism.
Yeah, the other thing I forgot to mention was like the Old Testament, or the New Testament's use of the Old Testament. Like when I really kind of allowed myself to look at that, I was like, out of Egypt I called my son, really, Matthew? Like, pulling stuff from Hosea. Like learning the historical context of some of that stuff. Like in the Second Temple period, like that's how people were using religious texts back then. Like that they were using the Old Testament to apply to their own communities and kind of taking them out of context, if you will, to kind of apply them to their own time, finding hidden meanings in the text. So like, it's not just that you kind of read the way that, the New Testament authors are using the Old Testament, and you can do that on its own and think, wow, that's a stretch. But when you actually learn historical context of that time period, it's even worse, for like, I don't want to go on my own rant there, but yeah. So this sort of like religious experience and religious disagreements, we've sort of touched on that. And it sort of ties into religious skepticism. But I guess one of my questions too is, what is your approach to, like, how do you view religious experience as evidence, and like why do you think religious disagreement is evidence against theism specifically?
So I think that religious experience is one of those things that could potentially change my mind on this. So like if I was thinking about like, hey, what is an event that could occur that I would just be like, okay, I changed my mind. Because it would be a religious experience. I was fortunate enough, and I think in 2017, to witness a solar eclipse. Let me just go ahead and tell you that every picture and every video you've seen of a solar eclipse is not even remotely captured by the experience of actually seeing a solar eclipse. It was the closest thing I would say that I've had to a religious experience. And I know that if I were born hundreds, thousands of years ago, saw that event and did not know that was a solar eclipse, I'd be like, there's a God, he is pissed, we're screwed. Like, it's kind of one of those things that I think it could be a very, very powerful motivation for belief. And so if I had a very cogent religious experience, I think that's something that would change my mind. From a purely evidential standpoint, so if we're going to compare something like theism to naturalism, so theism obviously predicts religious experiences. So naturalism doesn't. We might be able to use something like the weak anthropic principle to say, well, like naturalism does at least predict observers, in the sense that like there have to be observers to observe that there are observers in order, yada yada yada. But nothing about the weak anthropic principle implies that these observers have religious experiences. Theism trivially predicts religious experiences. Naturalism doesn't. Now, there's a more specific fact: religious disagreement. So, naturalism concedes, look, religious experiences might very well be more probable in theism than naturalism, but the fact that they disagree is evidence for this more particular fact, that there's such widespread disagreement. That fact is more probable in naturalism than theism, and so that there's the evidential weight actually does fall in naturalism's favor here. Again, that's one of the big threads that I felt from a very young age, was this problem of religious disagreement, and that it's just a trivial truth of probability, not a trivial truth of probability, but it's just a straightforward fact of probability that religious disagreement is more likely on something like naturalism than it is on something like theism. On theism, we would assume that God would care about the contents of our beliefs and why we believe them, because he wants to come into a loving relationship with us. So we would think that those sorts of things mattered. Like something like widespread religious disagreement is just not something that a perfectly loving and omnipotent God would just put up with.
Yeah. I know in my own life, like that was a big thing, you know, at least deconverting from Christianity. Cause I remember I would be involved and try to witness to people, and like, I would have a beer with them and take them through like The Reason for God by Tim Keller, you know, like just, I was one of those like long-term of it, like just, yeah, I was very invested, but you know, I would end up talking to like people that are in cults that are trying to witness to me, and I'm trying to witness to them. And it's kind of like a standoff, and like, you know, meet them for coffee. And it's like, the more that and not just Mormons, like there was this weird Mother God cult. I don't remember what it's called. I don't know if you've encountered these people, but anyway, I spent a lot of time talking to people that were, you know, believed either that were different sects of Christianity or just believed different things from me. And I could clearly see that like their personal religious experiences were motivating them to like basically to confirm the truth of their beliefs, that they were, you know, it was clear to see that was a huge like motivating factor. And in the same way I recognized, and it was mine, because I had what I took to be religious experiences. Maybe that might be slightly different between us, but the fact that, you know, I had what I took to be religious experiences, and like just based on testimony of other people, basically they're all experiencing this sort of thing that sounds identical to what I thought I was experiencing, except now they're deriving completely different conclusions from those experiences. I was just like, well, maybe this isn't a good way to know stuff. Like,
Yeah.
you know, like that was maybe this mechanism of like coming to knowledge is just not good. Like, and so it made me question. Yeah, that was just my own autobiographical, you know.
Oh, for sure. And I experienced something similar with evolution. So there's, you know, obviously a camp of theistic evolutionists that say, you know, look, evolution is just the mechanism that God used to create life. And I'm just like, I remember thinking on that and being like, no, this is a really crappy way of creating life. Like if you're trying to make complex life, like you could not have done it in a worse way. Like, because this is just, you know, suffused with, you know, gratuitous pain and suffering from non-human animals for just millions of years of just languishing in a struggle for survival. And 99% of, you know, all species that have ever lived are dead. Like this is a terrible way of creating complex life. What are you talking about?
Right. Evolution is evidence for God, Ben.
Yeah. Turn the tables.
But yeah, so what you just said there, actually, that's the next thing I was going to cover, was because the next section was, well, one of the next sections was biological evolution. So how is that, how would you frame that in terms of maybe an argument against theism or evidence against theism? Like, how would you frame it more specifically than what you just said? Because you kind of in a rhetorical flourish, kind of spell it out. But like, if you were to make it more precise, like, how would you use
For sure.
Yeah.
So what I would really want to start with is the teleological argument, because I think that this was a super important paradigm shift. So I think that most theists and most atheists would concede that, you know, the argument from design is trying to say that there's observations about the world that are more probable given something like intelligent design than chance. And so the famous example is from Pele, even though it's an example he used from someone else. It didn't actually originate with him, but the idea is that he finds a watch, and that on the ground, he might be an Aborigine caveman and not know what the watch is for, but he knows that it's not a natural thing, that someone designed it, that it had some sort of intention or purpose. And so he appealed to the human eye. The human eye is complex, it's delicate, but it performs a very, very specific function. And so that this fact, the fact that we have eyes is just more probable given an intelligent design than some sort of chance event. You know, the idea that our eyes could just pop into existence is crazy. But then Darwin comes along. And so all of a sudden the eye, facts about the eye, the way in which it is evolved, are now more probable given Darwin's theory of evolution than given in an intentional process. There are facts that you say, it's very weird. If an intentional designer was trying to make an eye, for him to make it this way would be very, very strange.
Mhm.
However, if we assume that evolution is a mindless process, that a non-uniform chance process, that through random genetic variation, non-randomly selects traits that survive in populations, the observations, the facts, the things that we observe about the eye are not surprising at all. In fact, that theory predicts that that's what we would observe about eyes. And so now the paradigm is shifted. The eye is no longer evidence for special creation, or intentional design. It's evidence for a mindless chance process.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is the bare bones fundamental intuition that's driving the argument from biological evolution. So we would say that if we take the fact of biological evolution, humans evolved over millions of years of, chemical, biological, or organic biological evolution. If we concede that observation is more likely given naturalism than theism. Why? Because theism would predict something like special creation, a more efficient, less cruel process than the piecemeal process we see in biological evolution. However, something like naturalism, or you don't even have to be a strong naturalist. You can just be a skeptic about intelligent design and think that there just are no disembodied minds. Just even that view, that there's just some mechanistic process that explains this, that theory, that hypothesis predicts that data better than theism does. And so that counts against theism. So when we let the evidential chip fall where it may, biological evolution falls in favor of a non-theistic hypothesis and counts against the theistic hypothesis. So that's roughly how. Now, certain people make much stronger claims than that. People, you can import an argument from this and say that, look, facts about biological evolution are facts about evil. Mm-hmm. And so these facts about evil entail that there is no God, or that there is no perfect being. So you can take this very broad minimalist outline of an argument, and you can make it really, really powerful. Obviously, new atheists, skeptics online, biological evolution is that's the thing. That's kind of the ace in the hole. Why is biological evolution the thing that should make you an atheist? How is it that it counts in favor so strongly for being an atheist, and is something that theists need to wrestle with, that it's a real problem for theism? And I think that's how. Right. I think that fundamental paradigm shift that happened with Darwin dealt a huge blow to the design argument alone, but also not only to the design argument, but just to rationality, the rationality of belief in God. Because really what kept, Enlightenment figures like Voltaire, Jefferson, Madison, the other deists of the American Revolution as well, all those figures that were deists, it's the argument from design. That's the piece that kept them in the deist camp. They might have eschewed traditional religion and the idea of a loving God that intervenes in the world, but they still held on to this watchmaker view of God that just kind of tinkered with the world and then said it's because of this. But once you, like you said, the pillar, once you take that pillar away, right, you now have the piece of evidence, biological evolution, that observation that Homo sapiens evolved from less complex organisms into more complex organisms. That's the observation that's evidentially weighty in favor of atheism.
Animals are happy and they don't feel pain. So
yeah, they're just machines. Descartes got it right. They're just machines. They just make noises and they sound like they're in pain, but they're not really in pain.
Yeah, that's one of the more infuriating responses to some of this.
Yeah.
But this actually again ties into, like one of the other things you spelled out was the problem of evil, but you kind of framed it in terms of like pointless evil or gratuitous evil. So if you want to elaborate a little bit about how you can run an argument like that, or why that makes you an atheist, those kinds of arguments.
Sure. So the thing about the problem of evil is that it's kind of a misleading label. There's not just one problem of evil.
Right.
It's really a family of related problems. And there are many different ways of formulating arguments from evil. Some are much more modest than others. Some are very ambitious. Some try to argue that some observation in the world logically entails that there is no God. Some people say that the very concept of God makes no sense, that there's things like incompatible properties. So another example would be that there's evidential arguments from evil. They might say, look, some observation doesn't rule out the possibility of a God logically. However, it's really, really powerful evidence for God. Others are even more modest still and say, look, the fact that there are these kinds of evil, that's the way the evidential chip fall, but it's not sufficient for belief. It tells us the direction we should believe given that observation, but it doesn't tell us what we should believe on our total evidence. And so with the problem of evil, one of the more powerful versions, I think, is this idea of an unjustified evil. It's the kind of evil that if we were to observe an unjustified evil, it would logically entail that there is no perfect being. And the idea here being that God is morally perfect and so wouldn't allow any unjustified evils so far as his power allowed him. However, God is omnipotent, so he has infinite power, so he can do anything that is logically possible. So the idea here is because of God's infinite power and moral perfection, there would be no unjustified evils. So what are some good candidates of an unjustified evil? And I think there are three broad candidates that are just really, really strong candidates for being an unjustified evil. The first is children that suffer with terminal diseases, things like bone cancer. A lot of the traditional theodicies just don't apply. They just don't help us understand. They just seem gratuitous. They seem unnecessary. They don't serve any morally fruitful function. Everyone is worse off because it happens. And we recognize it as something that's appropriately a tragedy. It's a tragedy because there is no greater good to it. It is gratuitous. That's the appropriate response to it. The second candidate is the idea of non-human animal pain. So I mentioned earlier in biological evolution, there's hundreds of millions of years of just non-human animal pain. So something like a small fawn dying in a forest, burning to death in a forest fire. This is pain that serves obviously no morally fruitful function, either for the fawn who dies alone or for anyone else around, because no one gets any sort of benefit or effect, good effect that would justify the fawn suffering this sort of pain. And the third idea is the idea of horrendous sufferings, the idea that people can suffer so horrendously that they lose themselves entirely, that they believe that their life is no longer on the whole worth living, that it would have been better if they just did not live at all. And so, an easy example here is someone, a victim of the Holocaust, someone that just suffered in the camps at Auschwitz and came to believe that God had forsaken them and that they were alone and that it was all for nothing and it would have been better if they didn't exist. And so that we're told free will is this great good. But is it such a great good? I'm skeptical of that. Is the ability to inflict horrendous suffering on other finite creatures really such a great good? Or would it have been better if something like the Holocaust just never happened? And so I think those are three really powerful candidates for an unjustified evil. So if any of these evils are in fact unjustified, then it would follow that there is no perfect being. And it's often assumed that if perfect being theism is false, then theism is false. That's the real contender in the question of for God's existence is perfect being theism.
Right. Yeah, I think the free will thing, that's one of the other questions that I always try to poke people with is, I think the statistic is like half of, because most Christians think that if a fertilized egg is a human person, basically like a baby, you know what I mean? They have souls or whatever. So like a zygote. And so I think it's like half of, a fertilized egg is like spontaneously abort. There's some really crazy statistic that when you look at it, it's like basically half or more of heaven's population are going to be people with no history, like no soul making. They're just going to wake up and like they're going to go to heaven. And was free will? I mean, obviously they might say that they still have free will, but okay, if they can have free will in a context where they're not going to sin and it's going to be great for them, like why? It just doesn't seem. It just seems like you could poke a lot of holes in like free will kind of thinking when you actually kind of hold people's feet to the fire and actually take practical considerations in. But I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, certainly. So I will go ahead and admit at the beginning that the question of free will is a rabbit hole in itself.
Mm-hmm.
One of the great things about philosophy of religion. But I challenge this idea that we have. So the free will defense, the idea that we have this, feature about us, this free will that's morally valuable, appeals to what's called a libertarian account of free will. This kind of contra-causal, we can rise above the causal laws that govern how our bodies and brains work. We can rise above that and make a decision that is uniquely our decision. That's kind of, we're the first cause. Like if you were to say, well, why did that event happen? It's because he caused it and not because some antecedent condition of the universe obtained, but because he intended it to happen. And so I'm skeptical of that conception of free will. I don't think that conception of free will is coherent. So I think that it was within an omnipotent being's power to create a world in which everyone freely chose right,
Mm-hmm.
but I understand freely in a compatibilist sense, a sense that would be compatible not only with determinism, the like laws of nature, but also things like the foreordained will of God. That it would, something has to cause our actions. We can't be the cause of ourselves. Just the same reason that we can't bite our own teeth or lift ourselves up by our bootstraps or look ourselves directly in the eye. The idea of something being causa sui, to use the jargon, just doesn't make any sense. This idea of libertarian free will is similar, that it's just an incoherent idea, and that it doesn't actually solve the problems that we think it does.
This might actually relate to one of the other points you made was the physical dependence of the mind on the brain. I don't know, because I think your views of free will obviously play into that. So, and that's another reason to be skeptical of theism. So we could tie those together if you want to talk a little bit about that as well.
Sure. So one of the things that I like to think separates me from other thinkers in the kind of non-theist philosophy of religion is that I defend what's called an argument from physical minds. So I think that the observation that all mental activity is observed in embodied brains, and that all known mental activity is the result of causal activity in the brain, is something that gives us reason to believe that there are no disembodied minds.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this argument has a much wider scope than I think a lot of people like to give them credit, because they like to say that, well, you can't infer facts about our minds. You can't infer facts about other minds from our minds. I'm like, well, actually, you can do that. That's literally what induction does.
Right.
And so, and that it's one of those things that we can rule out things, not rule out, but like have evidence against things like souls, ghosts, poltergeists, gods, any other way that we would conceive of a disembodied mind. I think there's good reason to believe that's not true. That view is false, because there's the conservation of energy. So I obviously have to be making some assumptions to get this conclusion. And so one of those assumptions is we observe that all mental activity has a physical basis in body brains. But we also assume the causal closure of the universe, the idea that the total energy in the universe is exactly zero and that it's a closed system. There's not something that comes from the outside and acts within it. Everything is causally contained within our universe. Now, there might be other bubble universes in a multiverse, but our universe would be causally contained. And so that this is just a straightforward implication of the conservation of mass and energy. And so that this probabilistically infers that it's more likely to observe that all mental activity has a physical basis in embodied brains if the universe is causally closed. So you have that assumption. When you assume something like theism, I think you get something radically different. God created a world separate and distinct from himself. We have mental activity that can survive our physical death into an eternal heaven, to be in relation. We are more like God, essentially, than we are more like this world. Those are just straightforward assumptions by most traditional theists. And I think if we have that model, that predicts something like substance dualism. Mm-hmm. And so I think these are reasons to think substance dualism is false. And so if substance dualism has these problems, it's just a straightforward judgment of probability that the observation that our minds are physically dependent on our brains is probabilistically favors the naturalistic hypothesis over a theistic one. And that there are facts about our brains that we can inductively justify by just sampling. We say, like, look, all minds that we have encountered have brains or some physical structure. The probability that the next mind we encounter will be the same is very, very high. And so these two arguments, I think, are two very, very powerful lines of thinking about how physical minds, the very nature of how our minds are, count against something like theism.
Right. So the last thing I wanted to touch on was hiddenness, which again is related to a lot of the stuff we talked about. But if you want to give a little spiel about that, I don't want to go too long because I try to keep these at least within an hour and a half. But yeah, so
fair enough.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on the hiddenness?
Yeah, so I think hiddenness is a variation of the problem of evil. So I've mentioned the problem of evil before. About how it's kind of really the problem of just bad stuff in the world, like how if there's an all good God and all powerful God, how is there just bad stuff? One of those bad things is that there are people like me, people who are non-resistant non-theists, people who are open to a relationship with God and who are not in any, their non-theism is not in any way part of an emotional opposition towards God. They're open to finding a higher power and having a relationship with it. So former believers like me are one example of a non-theist. An isolated non-theist, someone like an Amazonian tribesman, would be a non-theist, a non-resistant non-theist. A lifelong seeker, someone who spent their life trying to find God but never accomplished that, or someone who converted to a non-theistic tradition. These are all non-resistant non-theists. And that this is surprising, that this observation can actually entail that there is no perfectly loving being. Because if we start with the idea of a perfectly loving being, and to use an analogy, a perfectly loving parent, the idea is that perfectly loving God would always be open to relationship with every finite person. Just like a perfectly loving parent would always be open to relationship with their child. They would ensure that nothing they did put relationship out of reach. Now, they might let their child or creation go and do whatever they want but nothing they do will put the relationship out of reach. They will, for them, always be like a light that remains on unless they close their eyes. And so always being open to relationship means that everyone believes God exists unless they're somehow resisting it. Because in order to have a loving relationship with someone, you have to believe that they exist.
Right.
That's just a necessary condition of having a meaningful relationship with someone. I can't have a meaningful relationship with someone unless I believe they exist. And since I don't believe that they exist, and that opposition is not some resistance on my part, it's not me closing my eyes to the light, that fact entails that there is no being that is always open to relationship with us. And if there's no being that's always open to relationship with us, there is no perfectly loving being. And if there is no perfectly loving being, there is no God.
Right.
That's the argument from hiddenness.
Yeah. It's funny to me. People just double down. There are no non-resistant non-believers. And it's like,
yeah,
it's funny because like a lot of Christians, they want to make a big fuss about testimony. But you could line up 1,000 atheists all claiming like, oh, I don't know that God exists deep down. I don't hate God. And they'd be like, no, you're like, ignore the testimony of like thousands of people. And they're like, let's trust the testimony of people, stuff written decades after the fact by non-eyewitnesses, like it seems so silly to me. This kind of a different point, but anyway, yes. I think that's an interesting argument. So what, I guess to end, what are your plans for future content? What are the plans for real atheology? Like, when are we going to get some more stuff?
Yeah. So we've got a episode coming down the pipeline. I've got some buddies that are on my team that have really just been awesome. They've just been outstanding as far as helping create content behind the scenes. We've been doing debates. I've got a debate next week with Neil Maiman, who wrote Agent X. So it's going to be a debate on the Kalam cosmological argument and the tuning argument. So I'll be having a debate on that. That'll be, and we've got some interviews planned. I don't want to say that I have them yet, but we're hoping to get Michael Humer to do an interview here soon because he's written some, I think, interesting things on the fine-tuning argument. So that's what's on our horizon so far. I know that my guys behind the scenes have other ideas too, so hopefully we'll be able to bring some stuff together and get some more episodes as far as recordings and not just the debates that I've been doing. Really over the past year, like since COVID started, my focus has been writing debate briefs. So I try to condense all of my thoughts on different topics within the philosophy of religion into a single page, so that they're more digestible. And Twitter has helped me do this as well as getting this stuff out there. But they take a lot of they to be briefs. They're not so brief to write.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I really think those were helpful, and that's one of the things. I mean, with some of my stuff, other than interviews, this is my long form content, this kind of thing. My other videos are really short, but I spend a lot of time to make them that short because I'm trying to condense, just recently, I mean, more recently, I've started to try to popularize some philosophy of religion stuff in some of my shorter videos, but it takes a lot of work. I started seeing some of your briefs on Twitter, and I was like, wow, these are really, I like this. Like, this is what this is what the theists fear, like the academic stuff being popularized.
Yeah.
So,
but it takes a lot of work, a lot more work than I initially thought it would. I thought that I was going to be able to kind of just run through this, and I have just kind of my notes, and then I'll make them into briefs, and then those briefs would become chapters or blogs, and then the blogs would become chapters. But no, I've just spent all my time just writing the briefs.
Yeah. It's funny too. I didn't realize how big the real Atheology team was. I thought it was just the people like John and you and I forget the other guy's name, but there's two Bens. Yeah, there's two Bens. Yeah. So I thought it was just you three, and then like I started to realize, wow, there's a lot of people so I never know who I'm talking to. Like when that account on Twitter, I'm like, I have no idea who this is. Like I have no clue who's on this Twitter account right now.
So we've got a new member, Ryan Downey, as well, who's just been awesome. He also does the Exits Unknown page on Facebook. And we have two other people that work kind of behind the scenes, but don't want to be on the stage, if that makes sense. They help me with literature. They help editing. They help, revising, bouncing ideas off. And so I'm really fortunate to have the deep pool of serious thinkers that I do that are, because we obviously don't get paid for this or anything. Right. This is just our hobby that we do. And so for all of us to put as much effort and energy into it as we do, as a hobby, it's just awesome. It's a great community, and
Yeah.
I hope that our project helps people on all sides in their journeys.
Can't believe your hobby is trying to kill God. Wow.
I know, right?
I think that's a good stopping point. So I really enjoyed this. This was a great conversation. Thank you again for coming on. We can talk a little bit after I end the recording, but thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me.